welcome to our last day of Hearth and Harvest Apple Week. We hope you've had fun this week. We know we have, and thanks for tuning in so much to this virtual experience, which we've of course designed to try to bring us together this season with family and friends who are near and far, most likely virtually. I'm Lindsay from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and in collaboration with the new Museum of Food and Culture here in Denver, we're excited to bring you our final Apple Week video.
Yesterday, we hear personal stories. Today, we hear cultural stories. We are joining Madison Dillard and Laura Hughes for a discussion about the myth of the Johnny Appleseed story.
So sit back, relax, tune in with your pals, and enjoy.
Hello. I would like to introduce Laura Hughes, Madison Dillard, and myself, Lucor Jordan, and thank you for joining us for another segment of our Hearth and Harvest Festival.
Before we begin exploring the myth of Johnny Appleseed, we want to take a moment to talk about where it is we are presenting to you from. The three of us, the Museum of Food and Culture and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, are all occupying land stolen from the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. We are beneficiaries of the ongoing processes of settler colonialism, and that we are allowed to live, work, and play on these lands that are not ours with no consequence. While it is always important to keep attention to the lands on which we sit, it seems particularly important to acknowledge this fact the day after the settler colonial holiday of Thanksgiving and 2 days before the 156th anniversary of the Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29, 1864, with then Colorado Governor John Evans' endorsement and commanded by Colonel John Shivington, U.S. volunteer soldiers led an unprovoked massacre of peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples camped along the Sand Creek just 2 hours southeast of Denver. The two nations, being led by Chief Black Kettle, had negotiated a peace agreement and were camped in the location specified in that agreement and were flying a white flag of peace at their established camp. The massacre resulted in an estimated 150 casualties, most of whom were women, children, and elders.
Denver holds another specific colonial history as well, being one of the 9 federal relocation sites used by the United States government to promote assimilation into white stream American culture during the urban relocation program of the 1950s and 60s. This program was an attempt to force Native Americans into the mainstream, breaking up families and reservation communities while ultimately attempting to end the protected status of their lands. Relocation efforts by the Bureau of Indian Affairs were defined by empty promises of assistance during the transition to cities, where Native Americans faced isolation, segregation, discrimination, and culture loss. The legacies of this continue to impact Native Americans to this day. We would also like to acknowledge how environmental colonialism has changed the landscape. As settlers looked to make their settlements mirror European towns and farms, new plants and animals were aggressively introduced. It was not just apple trees that settlers planted across the continent in the process of erasing indigenous landscapes. Nearly all of the plants, trees, and grasses that settlers favored required water in large amounts, and this has led to settlers seeking to monopolize water as well as land.
We would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous communities that continue to reside in Denver, their elders, both past and present, and their future generations. Indigenous peoples, both within and beyond Denver, are strong, resilient communities who have maintained their cultures and lifeways while navigating through a colonial world which has tried at every possible outlet to extinguish them. Their peoples continue to flourish. We encourage you to take some time and read about the nations and peoples you reside alongside in your area and donate to their efforts to support their causes and communities. We have provided a handout to supplement this presentation, which provides some reading material to utilize to continue to learn about Indigenous peoples by Indigenous authors, as well as resources on organizations to follow and support. In societies where colonizers have moved and decided to stay, like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, settlers often create origin myths, stories that try to legitimize their place on the land. The story of Johnny Appleseed is one of those origin myths. John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed, was a Euro-American farmer and missionary who traveled the American West spreading Christianity and planting apple trees. His story is still told today, often taught to children in school, which introduces kids to the history of the land. Of course, Euro-Americans are here. Why wouldn't we be? We're friendly. We plant apples. What the story of Johnny Appleseed doesn't tell us is the hard truth of settler colonialism and the violence and destruction that the United States and Canada and other settler nations were founded on.
Depicted as a barefoot Bible orchardist who wears a cookpot on his head, Johnny Appleseed is a farmer missionary capitalist and an anti-elitist simpleton similar to mythologized Yankee Doodle. In both acquiring land and acquiring souls, the character of Johnny Appleseed's work is never finished. The difference between Johnny Appleseed and other colorful figures from our mythic history is that Johnny Appleseed was both a real man and a character. This story of Johnny Appleseed fits into the broad US myth as a nation founded on empty, fertile land, committed to fulfilling agrarian dreams of disenfranchised European farmers who would simultaneously Christianize and develop this untamed wilderness.
So these are just some talking points that we are going to discuss as we move forward with the presentation. And we know that some of these are pretty dense topics that maybe you are hearing about for the first time. So we do encourage you to utilize the handout that we are using to supplement this presentation to learn more about these topics. And if you have any questions or would like further dialogue about them, to contact us, which will also be provided on your handout. So one of the first things we want to get into is settler colonialism, which is something we have already discussed in this presentation, and that there is an important difference in settler colonialism versus extractive colonialism. Extractive colonialism is meant to extract resources from a land and leave when those resources have been exhausted. We see an example of this with the British colonization of India for their spices from 1757 to 1947. The colonization of the United States by colonial powers is differentiated from extractive colonialism, and that the resource desired in their invasion was land for occupation, and the settlers weren't going anywhere. The experience of settler colonialism is then an ongoing event that has no endpoint. We will discuss how settler colonialism is framed by continued projects of Indigenous elimination later on in the presentation.
An important project of settler colonialism is rewriting the narrative from settler colonial genocide to that of brave Christian heroes taming the West for the Christian God and pioneers. Settler Americans have a long history of presenting North America, especially the American West, as empty land that can be made prosperous by pioneering and settling. This myth is crucial for justifying and validating Western expansion and manifest destiny. Acknowledging that Indigenous peoples have lived on this land for millennia and continue to do so as 21st century nations and peoples is one way that we can challenge this myth and ongoing settler colonialism.
Programs such as the Ohio Company Associates, which guaranteed 100 acres of land to any planted 50 apple trees, 20 peach trees, first 3 years of settling were common. And this created a large demand for the work of an orchardist like John Chapman.
So this famous painting, American Progress, illustrates the settler American perspective of westward expansion. The lighter part of the image has pioneers, trains, stagecoaches, and power lines, all things that have been associated with progress coming from the east to the west. While the darker side of the image shows Indigenous peoples and bison that appear to be driven out of the West by settlers. Think about how this was made in 1873, the same time Johnny Appleseed's myth was becoming popular. This image has a secondary title, Westward the Course of Destiny, Westward Ho, Manifest Destiny.
And so part of the idea of manifest destiny was the notion of the doctrine of discovery. That was an idea used by settlers and settler colonial governments to justify the thefts of Indigenous lands during their westward expansion. We see the first invocation in 1823 during the Johnson versus McIntosh court case, the first of 3 cases that make up the Marshall Trilogy. In this short presentation, it is difficult to go into the nuances that make up this trilogy, so we have provided resources on the handout to explore these court cases and their implications further. The basic notion of its invocation, however, was the idea that Native American peoples were not deemed to be nations, for many due to their nomadic lifestyles, which according to John Marshall, the Supreme Court justice ruling over the case, did not change in character even if they were not nomadic, and they did not have full sovereignty over their lands. Rather, Native Americans were simply users of the land. They were roaming for shelter and substance. Using westernized notions of what constituted as productive use of the land, full land rights belonged to the nation who discovered the lands. Discovery in this use was understood as the use of land for agricultural development, which would secure full sovereignty and land rights to the individuals who participated in such labor. While the myth of Johnny Appleseed revolves around his calling from a guardian angel to go west to help build the nation, the reality is that John Chapman likely understood the planting of orchards to be an opportunity for economic growth by securing his ownership to the land. At the time of his death, John Chapman owned over 1,200 acres of land spread across Maine, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, West Virginia, and Ohio.
The idea of manifest destiny is built upon a simple Eurocentric belief in Western Christian civilization being the inevitable ideal to which all people with the capacity would move towards. Within this worldview, the settling of North America was an inevitable expression of destiny towards Christian capitalist progress. Equating the invasion with divinity and destiny also made it morally acceptable to utilize intentional spread of disease and famine, because Native Americans were bound to be overtaken by settlers who were making productive use of the land in the name of God and Christianity. It seems ironic then that Johnny Appleseed is often celebrated for his nomadic lifestyle, while Native Americans had their land stolen from them for the very same lifestyle.
So Johnny Appleseed's rise to popularity in the 1870s is likely not a coincidence, as we see a few significant events happening regarding Indigenous and settler colonial relations at that time. In 1874, gold was discovered for the first time in what is now called the Black Hills of South Dakota. In 1876, the Battle of Little Bighorn occurs in Montana. This battle, which resulted in a victory for the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, is commonly referred to as Custer's Last Stand. In 1879, the Carlisle boarding school is opened by Richard Henry Pratt in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. A few years later, in 1887, the Dawes Act is passed. What do all of these have in common? That the United States government viewed Native American peoples as threats to their westward expansion and actively worked toward their assimilation into white stream culture through the control of their bodies, cultures, and customs. One way that they were achieving active assimilation was through the work of missionaries, of which John Chapman was one. It is thought he was a follower of the theologian Emanuel Swedenborg, but what is significant is that he committed himself to being a missionary and spreading his beliefs, spreading religion not just to settlers, but to Indigenous peoples. While often more subtle and seemingly innocuous than agents of violent conquest, missionaries were vectors for disease, and their doctrines were embedded with social values and worldviews, which were incompatible with non-Western societies. Where missionaries traveled, they left social instability in their wake. Converts received privileged status in the strict colonial caste system, but the cost being in many cases that Indigenous peoples were severed from language, family, and extended social networks. Christianity also embedded unfamiliar gender divisions and power found in heteropaternalism, heteropatriarchy, and heteronormativity. Furthermore, religious education was often used as a pretense for the separation of Native American children from their parents and their eventual forced placement into the boarding school system.
Pioneers, from the earliest iterations of the word in French and English, were in reference to military action. Pioneers, peons, pawns, and pioneers are all referencing advanced foot soldiers. And in the case of the pioneers, these foot soldiers were armed with picks and shovels to lay the advanced infrastructure that would accommodate the full body of troops. The pioneers of the expansionist era of the US highlighted the Johnny Appleseed narrative and the advanced foot soldiers, creating the agricultural infrastructure that would feed the forts and troops movements far from the settlements along the East Coast, erasing Indigenous peoples and cultures along the way.
Johnny's religious beliefs forbid him from grafting, which is the only way to grow what we refer to as an eating apple. But he was not raising apples for eating. He was seeding the Western settlers with orchards that served two purposes: anchoring settlers to land and libations. Apple hard cider and apple liquor were the favored beverages of the time. Grain for beer is far more labor intensive and requires constant care and upkeep, where after an apple tree matures, very little effort needs to go into the orchard.
Within the myth of Johnny Appleseed, there's little to no mention of any Indigenous peoples he may have encountered. When they are mentioned, it's framed by a narrative of their respect and awe for Johnny Appleseed and the work he did. Moving out of the Johnny Appleseed myth and into the present, Indigenous erasure in the United States is as integral a part of our national narrative as it has ever been. Indigeneity is very conspicuously absent from our bureaucratic process and from our social discourse. This image was taken from the 2020 US election coverage on CNN, a perfect example of how Indigenous peoples are erased to this day.
Indigenous erasure and invisibility has significant impacts on how Native American peoples are understood by a non-Native public. A lack of discourse surrounding their histories and contemporary realities lends to misunderstandings and creates barriers in Native American fights for equity, social justice, and tribal sovereignty. Indigenous assertions of sovereignty are then further jeopardized by judges and law clerks who, per Crystal Echohawk's 2-year public opinion research study, Reclaiming Native Truth, admitted to knowing little about tribal sovereignty and federal Indian law.
Settler colonialism is an ongoing project framed by the logic of elimination towards Indigenous populations, in which invasion is a structure and not an event. Settler colonialism continues to be targeted at the acquisition of Indigenous land and territory, fueled by capitalist desire for economic gain and private ownership to generate economic capital. In order to acquire lands, Indigenous population must be eliminated from them. Education, myths, narratives, and museums are all examples of projects of settler colonialism that can work to continue to erase Indigenous peoples from their lands, erasing them from non-Indigenous consciousness.
The Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples are part of the past, present, and future of this land, now known as Denver. This compels us to encourage the support of organizations that center and uplift Indigenous lives. We are asking you to donate directly to Indigenous organizations so that we can put what we're doing here today into action. Please look to the handout with Indigenous organizations accepting donations or find organizations in your area. Thank you.
Such an interesting discussion. Many thanks to Madison and Laura for discussing the crucial pieces of the Johnny Appleseed story and how that myth plays into the American story.
That does it for Apples Week, our Hearth and Harvest virtual program that we hope brought you together with your loves from near and far. Remember, you'll always have access to all of the videos that you've seen here from Apple Week by continuing to visit the Denver Museum of Nature and Science's YouTube page. Also, be sure to visit www.museumoffoodandculture.org to get a lot more content about apples, food, and culture.
If you enjoyed our programming this week, please consider making a donation in support of our museums.
Go ahead and keep your eyes peeled for the next installment of Hearth and Harvest, which we expect to launch in December, right around the Christmas holiday week. Thanks again for joining us. We're so happy to have you with us. And take care. Hang in there.